지난달 말에 포르투갈의 신트라에서 ECB 포럼이 있었는데요. 이날 전 세계 금융을 쥐락펴락하는 미국, 영국, 일본, 유럽의 중앙은행장들이 패널로 나와서 각 나라의 통화정책, 인플레이션, 고용 상황 등에 대한 논의를 하는 자리를 가졌습니다. 흥미로웠던 부분은 이날 진행자로 나왔던 세라 아이젠이라는 현 CNBC 앵커가 은행장들이 답하기 곤란한 날카로운 질문들을 많이 던졌는데요. 물론 각 지역의 은행장들은 혹시라도 본인들의 발언이 자산시장에 영향을 끼칠까 최대한 형식적이고 이미 알고 있는 사실에 대한 반복적인 답변이 대부분이었습니다. 그래도 투자자들이 궁금해하는 질문들에 대한 답변을 끄집어내기 위해 노력한 부분에 대해서는 진행자가 진행을 참 잘했다고 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 금리 인상에 대해 각 나라가 현재 어떤 스탠스를 갖고 있는지에 대한 질문인데요. 영상을 먼저 한번 보시겠습니다.
President Lagarde, I'll start with you as the host of this meeting. On the view from Europe, I'm curious where all of you are in terms of this policy path. We've certainly seen a fight against inflation. You've been very clear that there's more work to do. How much more?
So, as far as the European Central Bank is concerned and the Eurosystem at large, we have covered a lot of ground. We have increased our interest rates by no less than 400 basis points in very short order, less than a year, and we still have ground to cover. And I think that, as I said earlier on, we are data dependent. We will decide on a meeting-by-meeting basis, but we know that we have ground to cover. And if our baseline stands, then we also know that we will very likely hike again in July.
What about September?
That I will not tell you, and for a very simple reason that I just mentioned, we are data dependent. We'll decide meeting by meeting, and we'll tell you. For the September meeting, we will have received a lot more data, information, survey results, and it's going to be another projection meeting prepared by the staff of the ECB. So we will have a lot in our hands to make our decision then.
Governor Bailey, you surprised the market recently, raising interest rates by 50. You did a double. Why did you feel the need to do that?
Well, it really picks up on the theme that Christine has just developed. First of all, the UK economy has turned out to be much more resilient, and that's a good thing. There's many good aspects to that, but what goes with that resilience is signs of a very tight labour market, which is showing through in pay awards, but also showing through. We've got an unemployment rate of 3.8%, which is historically right at the low end. So that resilience is coming through that way. But when we looked at again, to Christine's point, when we looked at the data, because we too are being driven by evidence at the moment, the cumulative data, both particularly on the labour market and on the inflation release we had, which to us showed clear signs of persistence, caused us to conclude that we had to make really quite a strong move at that point. It was justified.
Have you received a lot of flack for the move?
Well, I think at the moment I can understand why there are critics of us and central banks. We have a job to do. I'm very clear that our job, all of us are very clear, I think our job is to return inflation to target, and we will do what is necessary. I understand the concerns that go with that, but I'm afraid I always have to say that it is a worse outcome if we don't get inflation back to target.
Chair Powell, you've said it many times, and yet you paused, but you're not calling it a pause, and you're not calling it a skip. So what are we calling it?
So what we're calling it is maintaining the level of the federal funds rate at its current level for this meeting. Thank you. And we did that. If you think about it, we've raised the federal funds rate by 500 basis points since a little more than a year ago. And we think, so we've come a long way. We also think that there's more tightening power coming through. Really, policy hasn't been restrictive for very long. We started at negative real interest rates, and we've now moved up to where we actually are in restrictive territory, but we haven't been there very long. So we believe there's more restriction coming. And what's really driving it, to Andrew's point and Christine's as well, is very strong labor market. We've got a labor market that, where jobs are being created, there's strong wage gains, and that's driving spending, driving real incomes and driving spending, which is driving more demand and continuing to drive labor market. So the labor market is really pulling the economy. And my colleagues and I, as you will know, wrote down in our SEP 2 more additional rate hikes. The median was quite a strong majority, actually wanted 2 or more rate hikes. And the reason for that was, if you look at the data over the last quarter, what you see is stronger than expected growth, a tighter than expected labor market, and higher than expected inflation. So that tells us that although policy is restrictive, it may not be restrictive enough, and it has not been restrictive for long enough.
3명 모두 마치 약속이라도 한 듯 비슷한 답변을 하는 모습이 보이네요. 노동시장이 견고하기 때문에 인플레이션이 잘 잡히지 않고 그래서 금리를 빠른 속도로 높게 올렸고 향후에는 경제 지표에 대한 데이터를 근거로 결정을 하겠다 라고 다들 비슷한 답변을 하고 있습니다. 특히 파월 형님은 지금까지의 금리 인상이 실물 경제에 영향을 미치기까지는 아직 시간이 더 필요하다는 얘기를 했는데 결국 실업률이 올라가고 임금 상승이 줄어야 인플레이션을 잡을 수 있다는 거고 그때까지 시장 상황을 봐가면서 금리 인상을 하겠다는 얘기를 하고 있습니다.
So I don't get why you didn't raise rates at the last meeting, especially I think it was a surprise that it was a unanimous decision to hold rates steady when you said a majority think that they still need to go farther on raising rates.
It's really just as you get closer and closer to the goal. What we're aiming for is a stance of policy that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. As you get closer to that, you get closer to the place where the risks become more in balance. So, we did 4 75 basis point hikes in a row starting in June of last year. In December, we moved down to 50. Then we did 3 consecutive 25 basis point hikes. So this is really just a continuation. We're going to move the decisions a little bit, make them with a little bit more time in between them, in an effort to get more information from the data to see how much restraint is really coming from these, through the pipeline from rate hikes that we only made now, in many cases, 6, 8, 9 months ago. So that's why we did it.
So maybe in every other meeting hike.
We've not decided that. So the only thing we decided was not to raise rates at the June meeting. We have not made a decision to go to that. It may work out that way. It may not work out that way. But I wouldn't take, moving at consecutive meetings off the table at all.
I'm trying.
사회자가 금리 인상의 정확한 시기와 횟수에 대해 답변을 끄집어내려고 노력하는 모습이 보이는데 우리 노련한 파월 형님 절대 넘어가지 않고 애매한 답변으로 잘 넘어가는 모습이 인상적입니다.
Governor Ueda, you have decided to maintain your easier monetary policy in the face of rising inflation. Why?
So a simple answer would be, although the headline rate of inflation is above 3%, which is well above the 2% inflation target, we think underlying inflation is still a bit lower than 2%. That's why we are keeping policy unchanged at the moment.
Even though we've seen measures, including core, right, higher than the 2%
the usual
level.
core is also above 2%. But let's say, let's look at the rate of increase in wages, which is an important determinant of underlying inflation. It has risen, but is now running at around 2%. Now, if you want a 2% inflation rate, wage inflation that's consistent with that would be slightly or well above 2% if you assume productivity growth rate is positive.
이 부분은 저도 왜 우에다 총재가 헷갈리게 얘기를 했는지 모르겠는데요. 일본의 최근 핵심 물가가 3.2%가 나왔거든요. 근데 우에다 총재의 말에 의하면 결국 핵심 물가가 2%를 상회하더라도 임금 물가가 올라가기 전까지는 금리를 올릴 계획이 없다는 얘기를 하는데 근데 여기 그래프를 보면 일본의 핵심 물가가 14개월 연속 2%를 상회하고 있습니다. 참고로 일본의 핵심 물가는 음식만 제외하는 거고요. 코어 인플레이션 레이시라는 지표가 음식과 에너지를 제외한 인플레이션인데 이건 심지어 최근 4%를 넘었습니다. 일본이 지금 거의 6년이 넘게 마이너스 금리 정책을 유지하고 있는데 우에다 총재 말대로 2024년에 인플레이션이 더 높게 올라서 그때 잡는다면 제 생각에는 조금 늦을 수도 있지 않나 이런 걱정이 들지 않을 수가 없는 것 같습니다.
When it comes to the inflation path for you, I mean, I know you'd like to see it continue to rise from here, right? What would it take for you to really strongly consider abandoning the yield curve control and negative rates?
So we have a forecast or a projection of inflation path that looks like it's going to go down for a while toward the end of this year on declines in import prices, and it's spilled over to domestic prices. And from there on, we are forecasting some increase in the rate of inflation into 24. But we are less confident about the second part. If we become reasonably sure that the second part is going to happen, that could be a good reason for a policy change.
Chair Powell, we've seen some progress in the US. Certainly, if you look at the headline CPI from 9% down to 4%, I know you're focused on core, but what would make you feel better about it that you could remain on hold?
So the progress on headline inflation coming down is certainly welcome and ought to help keep inflation expectations anchored. But I think it actually helps to think about core inflation broken into three pieces. The first of which is goods inflation. And we've seen goods inflation coming down for 6 months now. And that's because supply chains are improving, the shortages are more or less gone, and also because consumption is moving back to services and away from goods. So that part of the story makes sense. Housing services is the next piece, and between that and goods, you have a little bit less than half of the total index. And you see now the new rents that are coming in are at lower increases or no increase, and so there's significant disinflation in the pipeline there, but it's going to take 12 months or 18 months to get there. The place where we haven't really seen much progress is in non-housing services, which is a little more than half of our core PCE inflation index, and that's hotel services, travel services, food service, financial services, healthcare, those things. It's generally very labor intensive. Some of it's quite cyclically sensitive, but some of it's not. The point is, that's where we're not seeing a lot of progress yet, and the reason is that, or one explanation for it is that labor costs are really the biggest factor by far in most parts of that sector, and so what we need to see, we've seen a lot of signs of softening in the labor market, but it's just kind of beginning. We need to see a better alignment of supply and demand in the labor market and see some more softening in labor market conditions so that inflationary pressures in that sector can also begin to subside.
실제로 ISM 서비스 PMI를 보면 금년 6개월 연속 서비스 쪽이 활황이었다는 걸 보여주는데요. PMI 숫자가 50 이상이면 경제가 성장 중인 걸로 해석하시면 됩니다.
Are you surprised that hasn't happened yet after 500 basis points of tightening already in a little over a year?
Yes, I think widely it's been surprising that inflation has been this persistent, but I think the bottom line is that policy hasn't been restrictive enough for long enough to start to see those effects. And the service sector is not especially interest rate sensitive, by the way, as opposed to, for example, the goods sector. So we wouldn't expect it to be the first to be affected. But we would ultimately expect, as demand softens and as the labor market conditions go more into balance between supply and demand, we would expect to see inflationary pressures subside in that sector as well.
Yeah, it sort of raises the question, Chair Powell, about whether we need to see a much higher unemployment rate in the US, and you're all dealing with a tight labor market, to finally really break inflation.
So, the way we think about that is that
영상을 보시다 보면 인플레이션 expectations, 즉 기대 인플레이션이 앵커가 됐다는 말이 자주 언급되는데요. 여기서 앵커라는 말은 미 연준의 목표 물가인 2%대에 민간 부문의 장기 기대치가 일치한다는 뜻입니다. 다시 말해서 소비자들이나 기업이 현재 체감상으로는 물가가 높다고 느껴도 장기적으로는 물가가 안정될 거라고 기대를 했을 때 앵커라는 표현을 쓰고요. 반대로 단기적인 고물가에 대해 그런데
wage pressures are
미래에도
still high, but they're
물가가
they're
높아질
definitely
거라고
coming
예상할
down.
때는 de-anchor라는
You're seeing
표현을 쓴다고
surveys of
이해하시면
workers and
되겠습니다.
businesses suggest that the labor market
기대
is not as
인플레이션이
tight as it
중요한
was a
이유는
year or two ago.
기대 인플레이션에
So
따라서
you're seeing
실제
job
인플레이션도
creation
변동을 하기
is beginning to
때문인데요.
come down. There are a number of
예를 들어 모두가 내년까지
indicia that would
물가가
suggest that
3%대로
we're
오를
getting
거라고
the
예상을
softening that
하면
we need. We're getting it slower than
근로자들은
we
그에
expected.
상응하는 임금
But
인상을
nonetheless,
원할
it's happening.
것이고
So it's still a possibility.
기업들도
But, you know,
상품 가격을
they're
올릴 수
so-
있기
it's so
때문에
uncertain right now.
기대
That-
인플레이션에
in my
대한
view,
지표를
the least
연준에서
unlikely
중요하게
case
보고
is that we
있습니다.
do find our way to
파월이 금리를
better
계속 인상-
balance without a really severe
파월이
downturn.
금리를 계속
I think
인상하겠다고
there's-
하면서
I think
겁을
there's
주는
a
것도
significant probability
물론
that there will
실제로
be a
금리를
downturn
올려서
as well,
물가를
but it's
잡겠다는
not
의지도
to me the
있지만
most likely case.
이런 식으로 소통을
That's
하면서
the hard landing
민간
scenario.
부문의 인플레이션
Or just
기대치가
I wasn't even thinking of
2%로
hard landing. I
안착을
was thinking
시키려는 데
of
목적이
even
있다고
a,
보시면 될 것
you know, a
같습니다.
recession. To me, it's
현
not the
상황에
most likely
대해서
case, but it's certainly
기대
possible. Of
인플레이션이
course, many
앵커가
forecasters
됐다는
do
표현을
predict
쓰는
that.
것도
Is-
민간 부분에서
Is Europe in
미 연준이
recession?
장기적으로는
President Lagarde?
2%대로 물가를
we've seen two
안정시킬
negative
수
quarters of
있을 거라는
GDP. I
기대를
don't know how
갖고
you
있다는
define it,
뜻으로
but-
I think the first
해석하시면
quarter of
되겠습니다.
23 was actually completely flat, wasn't negative. So technically, I think you could argue that we did not see a recession, but it's stagnant, to say the least. And the, you know, the expectations for Q2, particularly in the industrial sector, if I look at PMI numbers, are not particularly are not giving us great hope that there will be a strong recovery. We see a second half of 23 up from the first half, certainly, but moderate. We have a 0.9 forecast for the whole year.
Do you agree with Chair Powell? Do you think you can get away with this tightening cycle without dragging Europe into recession?
Our baseline does not include a recession, but it's part of the risk out there.
자, 그럼 팩트 체크를 한번 해보겠습니다. 러가드 총재는 유럽은 리세션이 아니다라고 언급을 했는데요. 여기 유로스탯의 자료를 보면 참고로 유로스탯은 유럽연합의 공식 통계에 관한 사무를 관장하는 유럽위원회 하부의 산하기구입니다. 당연히 유럽연합의 통계 관련해서는 가장 신뢰할 수 있는 기관이겠죠. 근데 자료를 보면 유로 에리아, 즉 유로존은 2022년 4분기에 마이너스 0.1%, 2023년 1분기에도 마이너스 0.1% 성장을 기록했는데요. 통상적으로 2분기 연속 GDP가 마이너스 성장이면 리세션으로 정의가 가능합니다. 근데 유럽연합을 보시면 2022년 4분기에 마이너스 0.2%, 금년 1분기에는 0.1% 성장으로 리세션을 간신히 모면했습니다. 근데 러가드가 총재로 있는 유럽 중앙은행은 유로존의 통화정책과 물가 등에 대한 경제 정책을 정하는 기관이지 엄밀히 말하면 유럽연합 전체의 금융 시스템을 관리하는 기관이 아닙니다. 그렇다면 유로존의 GDP 성장률을 보고 답변을 해야 되는 게 맞는데 유럽연합에 대한 답변을 한 건지 아니면 리세션의 정의를 다르게 해석하는 건지 그것도 아니라면 향후 금리를 더 올리기 위해 밑밥을 까는 건지는 시간이 지나봐야 알 것 같습니다.
I asked if you guys coordinated or talked about monetary policy before. I mean, does that happen? Should it be more coordinated? Because you're all doing different things right now.
Well, I mean, if I start, I mean, obviously what we don't do is say, what shall we do, what shall you do? Because we're all setting monetary policy for our areas, and that's the law in all of our areas, actually, so we don't do that. But we do talk a lot, and I think it's important. I mean, it's important at all times, but it's particularly important in recent times at the moment because we're facing such big global shocks. I mean, we've got common shocks. They differ a little bit in terms of their impact and their effect, but there's some huge global events going on that are affecting all of us. So, I think we do talk quite a lot and we see each other quite a bit because it's important we do that. And, we share wisdom on how we're sort of interpreting the things that are going on around us.
Economic conversation, it gets into an interesting question, Chair Powell, where now we're wondering, easier to fight inflation last year when the economy was doing better, but now that we're seeing signs of softness and weakness in manufacturing, and you mentioned the labor market starting to cool off, about overdoing it and the risk of overdoing it. Do you wonder about that, or you're still just focused on inflation?
Let me say the U.S. economy has actually been quite resilient, and the data that we're still seeing, including since the last meeting, still is consistent with with an economy that's resilient and growing, albeit at a modest pace. As I mentioned earlier, though, yes, there was no question. The first question was how fast should we go, and we went pretty fast, and we got to a level that we believe is restrictive. We're in restrictive territory. If you take the federal funds rate and you subtract, some forward-looking measure of expected inflation, you'll get a significantly positive real rate, meaning we're probably in restrictive territory. So, and I think we have steadily slowed the pace of our moves, and it's appropriate to do so for one reason, because the more information we get, the better decisions we'll make. The risks of doing too much versus doing too little become more in balance. I wouldn't say they're in balance yet, but they're becoming closer to balance. I still believe and the committee clearly believes that there's more work to do, that there are more rate hikes that are likely to be appropriate, though.
So you think the risk is still of doing too little and not getting control of inflation?
Yes, and of course
But inflation expectations are, I don't have to tell you, very well anchored.
No, but the thing with the risks is that there may be social costs associated with restoring price stability. The social costs of failing to restore price stability will be higher in almost all likely cases. We've seen what that looks like, and it's just something that we have to do. It's one of the principal things that society counts on us to accomplish, and I think we all feel committed to accomplishing it. It is of course a good thing that inflation expectations have remained anchored all this time, but our understanding of inflation expectations is not a precise one, and the longer inflation remains high, the more risk there is that inflation will become entrenched in the economy. So we have to, the passage of time is not our friend here.
영상을 보시다 보면 inflation expectations, 즉 기대 인플레이션이 앵커가 됐다는 말이 자주 언급되는데요. 여기서 앵커라는 말은 미 연준의 목표 물가인 2%대에 민간 부문의 장기 기대치가 일치한다는 뜻입니다. 다시 말해서 소비자들이나 기업이 현재 체감상으로는 물가가 높다고 느껴도 장기적으로는 물가가 안정될 거라고 기대를 했을 때 앵커라는 표현을 쓰고요. 반대로 단기적인 고물가에 대해 미래에도 물가가 높아질 거라고 예상할 때는 de-anchor라는 표현을 쓴다고 이해하시면 되겠습니다. 기대 인플레이션이 중요한 이유는 기대 인플레이션에 따라서 실제 인플레이션도 변동을 하기 때문인데요. 예를 들어 모두가 내년까지 물가가 3%대로 오를 거라고 예상을 하면 근로자들은 그에 상응하는 임금 인상을 원할 것이고 기업들도 상품 가격을 올릴 수 있기 때문에 기대 인플레이션에 대한 지표를 연준에서 중요하게 보고 있습니다. 파월이 금리를 계속 인상하겠다고 하면서 겁을 주는 것도 물론 실제로 금리를 올려서 물가를 잡겠다는 의지도 있지만 이런 식으로 소통을 하면서 민간 부문의 인플레이션 기대치가 2%로 안착을 시키려는 데 목적이 있다고 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 현 상황에 대해서 기대 인플레이션이 앵커가 됐다는 표현을 쓰는 것도 민간 부분에서 미 연준이 장기적으로는 2%대로 물가를 안정시킬 수 있을 거라는 기대를 갖고 있다는 뜻으로 해석하시면 되겠습니다.
Well, it gets into the question about the markets, and you're saying that it's a transmission mechanism. You're all talking very hawkishly and saying there's more work to be done and we're still worried about inflation. The markets pretty much think you're almost done, all of you guys. Maybe one more hike in July and then done, and then into cuts next year. Is that wrong, President Lagarde?
I look at the data we have. I look at the mandate we have. I look at the transmission lag, and we've decided for ourselves that we would use 3 criteria.
Is it counterproductive to you that the stock market has rallied, the bond market has rallied? I mean, the market is fighting the Fed. The market thinks you're closer to the end, and I mean that does make financial conditions easier.
Wasn't that the?
You can't fight the Fed, but they're fighting the Fed. Is that a problem?
I don't see it that way. I don't look at it that way at all. Honestly, we have different jobs. Our job is to bring inflation down to 2% and sustain maximum employment. That's our job. That's what we think about. We look at the data, and that's what we care about. And markets react. Different parts of the market react in different ways. It's just not something that is a principal focus of our work.
But it did seem last year like you wanted a weaker stock market. You used the word pain at Jackson Hole. It seemed like you were trying to communicate that financial conditions should tighten, and less so this year. Is that right?
Not really, no.
Okay.
Of course, we work through financial conditions. That's what we do. Our rate and our, all the things we do and say work through financial conditions to affect the real economy. That's how it works. But it's broader financial conditions. So we're not focused on any one market. We're never thinking, oh, let's do this to this market. It's just in general, let's communicate what we want to do and why we want to do it. And financial conditions adjust. And that's really all we can do. We do not target particular parts of the market, although of course we do monitor market conditions.
So you don't care what the stock market's doing?
I look at broader financial conditions. It's one of many conditions, along with interest rates, credit spreads, everything, all of the conditions and the availability of credit. It's one of many things. Again, we don't focus on any one thing as the key thing.
근본 ECB 포럼에서 주요 부분만 간추려서 영상을 한번 올려봤는데요. 영상 하단에 링크를 달아놨으니 시간이 되시는 분들은 풀 영상을 한번 보시기를 추천드립니다. 그럼 오늘 영상은 여기서 마치도록 하겠고요. 도움이 되셨다면 구독과 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.